Hi everybody, today we're going to be talking about the general overview of photosynthesis. You can see we've moved into the second half of our unit and we are currently here. We will then move on to the stages later this week and we'll also be talking about some other unique types of photosynthesis. Then we'll be done with this unit. The learning objective today is that you should be able to describe the role of energy in living organisms. We're focusing more on solar energy this time instead of the chemical energy of glucose. Some of the language objectives you should be able to use when you describe the role of energy in living organisms is autotroph, heterotroph, photosynthesis, mesophyll, stomata, thylakoid, granum and grana, and stroma. So to kind of review where we were and where we're going is to let's tie them together. Let's show how photosynthesis and cellular respiration are connected. So there's free energy in an ecosystem. So it'd be any energy that is able to allow work to occur in the system. In this case, we're going to talk about ATP. Okay. So with ATP, we could focus on autotrophs' use of ATP and heterotrophs' use of ATP in a system. Let's lean towards the autotrophs first. So auto means self and troph means nourishment. So this would be an organism that could self-nourish itself. There are two types of autotrophs. There are autotrophs that can do chemosynthesis, which use other chemicals to synthesize their energy or their food. And then there's photosynthesis. These would be autotrophs that use sunlight in order to create their food or glucose. Photosynthesis is what we're going to focus on, not chemosynthesis. And photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide and water in order to occur. From this reaction, we will get glucose and then the waste product of oxygen. There are two steps in photosynthesis. The first step is called the light-dependent step because light is needed along with carbon dioxide and water to do photosynthesis. There's also a second step called the Calvin cycle. The place that this process occurs is the organelle, the chloroplast, which you only find in plant cells. Heterotrophs, which hetero means different or unalike, so it'd be different nourishment. And heterotrophs do aerobic cellular respiration. So we have to consume our glucose, right, in order to make our ATP. When we can't do aerobic cellular respiration, we do fermentation. Fermentation does not require oxygen and we get less ATP. There are 3 stages or 4 stages to aerobic cellular respiration. The first one is glycolysis, then the citric acid cycle, and then oxidative phosphorylation. But like I've told you before, sometimes pyruvate oxidation gets clumped in with citric acid cycle, so it gets left out. So some books would say there's only 3 stages, but we've been teaching it as there's 4. So glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and then oxidative phosphorylation. And as you know, the 2A, 2B, and 3 all occur in the mitochondria, while glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. All right, so let's jump into it. We already talked a little about what an autotroph is, so a self-feeder or self-nourishment. So they make their own nutrients, and they are going to be what provides organic molecules for other organisms. What are photoautotrophs? When you look at this picture here, you can see all the plants and seaweed that is in this ocean ecosystem. This seaweed is a photoautotroph. It's using light to make its own food. The seal that you see floating around is a heterotroph. It's actually eating some of this seaweed. So it eats others. It eats things that are not like itself. It cannot make its own nutrients. It has to consume other organisms to get its nutrients. Let's define photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which autotrophs use solar energy to convert carbon dioxide and water to sugar and other organic molecules, and they release oxygen as a byproduct. Here is the chemical equation for photosynthesis, but something's missing: light. Okay, so if you notice, the outputs or the products are actually going to be the inputs or the reactants of cellular respiration. And if you notice that the reactants here are actually the products from cellular respiration. So these two reactions are coupled together. The difference is there's not ATP here, it's light energy. So some questions I want to ask you is, which reactant is reduced and which is oxidized? Also, which reactants are going to form glucose? Finally, which reactants form oxygen? The reactant that is going to be reduced is carbon dioxide. If you look here, this carbon dioxide is going to gain hydrogens and electrons, and it's going to become glucose. Water is going to be oxidized. If you look here, water is going to be oxidized into oxygen. It's going to lose hydrogens and electrons. Which reactant forms glucose? Carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is going to be used to make glucose, and you'll see this more clearly when we get to the process of photosynthesis. And then which reactants form the oxygen is the water, and you'll understand more how this happens as we go through the process of photosynthesis. When you look here at the equation, you can see in photosynthesis that the carbon dioxide is reduced and that water is oxidized. Water is the reducing agent and carbon dioxide is the oxidizing agent. So here you can see carbon dioxide is going to be reduced into glucose, and here water is oxidized into oxygen. So gaining electrons and hydrogens, losing electrons and hydrogens. To do a little extension, you guys are going to read section 7.3. You could stop for a second and read it in your book and do the CHA, and then come back and try to answer these questions. You could pause the video here and then come back and check your answers. All right, I'm assuming you've read it and you've paused it and tried to answer these questions. So what was the hypothesis in the 1800s? So we used to think that the oxygen that came from photosynthesis actually came from carbon dioxide, not water. This was the initial hypothesis. But then C.B. van Niel proposed that the water was actually the one releasing the oxygen. So how did van Niel's hypothesis get confirmed? So what they did is they attached a heavy isotope of oxygen 18 to carbon dioxide and also to water. They gave one plant first the labeled heavy isotope oxygen 18 carbon dioxide first. And at the end, they analyzed the oxygen that was released and if it contained the heavy oxygen 18 isotope or not. It did not. Then they did it again with water, and that water contained the labeled heavy oxygen isotope oxygen 18. When they processed the oxygen that was released from that plant, it did contain the oxygen 18 molecules. So they know that it was the water that was actually releasing the oxygen, and it was being oxidized, and not the carbon dioxide. So what did you learn from this story? I don't know, that's up to you. But I hope that you're seeing that we have to find evidence, and there's many different indicators out there like heavy isotopes that we can use to trace the pathway of these processes. Also, if you really do the math and dug deeper, you would find out that some water is also created from the process of the citric acid cycle, which is, not the citric acid cycle, from the Calvin cycle, which is part of photosynthesis. And what's most important, though, is that you can see in this picture using the color blue that they could trace that the oxygens came from the heavy isotope 18. The red or the pink color here is showing you what they saw when the carbon dioxide was labeled with the heavy isotope 18. So there are some waters created during the second process in photosynthesis, but we don't usually talk about those waters as a product. We only talk about the glucose being a product and the oxygen. Okay, so let's really get into it here. So let's talk about the site of photosynthesis. Obviously, photosynthesis happens on the leaves of plants. So if you look at this plant here, this is a leaf, this is the stem. This is a more zoomed in version of the leaf. So if you look here in the leaf, they are made of mesophyll cells. Mesophyll cells have a ton of chloroplasts inside of them. So they're not just like regular plant cells. They have more chloroplasts than other cells do. So if you look here at the picture, this is the leaf, and this would be the epidermis of the leaf. There's also holes in the leaves called the stomas. And this would be the vein of the plant. So let's talk about the leaf anatomy a little bit. Some of the key words you need to know is mesophyll, which is the inner green tissue of a leaf. And chloroplasts are concentrated in those. You also need to know the stomata or stoma. You could say it either way. Like I said, these are the tiny openings in the leaves epidermis, and they are for releasing oxygen after the process is over and also taking in carbon dioxide that the plant needs for photosynthesis. The veins of the plants are what are transporting water to them from the roots. So here's an enlarged image of a mesophyll cell, and you can see all of the chloroplasts that are inside of it. So let's talk about the chloroplast a little bit more. So the chloroplast has an inner membrane, which would be this yellow line right here, an outer membrane, which is out here, because it is also double membrane, just like the mitochondria. Remember, because we think it used to be a free-living prokaryote. It also has an intermembrane space, which is this area in between the outer and inner membrane. And then the most important parts are here in red. The stroma, which is 4 here in the picture, it's the empty space. It's a liquid filled with enzymes inside the cell. The thylakoids, which are these discs that you see that are stacked on top of each other. So in this picture here, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 thylakoids in this stack. And a stack of thylakoids is called a grana. So there are 2 stages to photosynthesis. What are these 2 stages? One is called the light-dependent reaction, and the other one is sometimes called the light-independent reaction, meaning it doesn't require light to happen. It's also called the Calvin cycle because this is the name of the scientist who discovered the Calvin cycle. Where is this happening? The light reaction happens in the thylakoids, specifically in the inner membranes of these thylakoid stacks. The Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, which is the space within the chloroplast. So you're looking at a chloroplast here, an outer membrane, an inner membrane, an intermembrane space, the stroma, and then the thylakoids, which a stack of them together is called a grana. We're going to talk about the inputs and outputs. You can see from this picture that both reactions, the light-dependent and the light-independent, have different inputs and outputs. So for the light reaction, you require light and water, and the output is going to be oxygen, also ATP and NADPH. The Calvin cycle requires carbon dioxide, no light, no water, just carbon dioxide, and also ATP and NADPH. And it'll create as an output the NADP plus and the ADP plus an inorganic phosphate, as well as sugar and water as a waste product. We don't often talk about this water though. And then 4, how are these reactions coupled? The coupling that are happening here is between them with the NADPH and ATP. It's like a cycle. The NADPH is going to be used and regenerate NADP+, and the ATP will be used and regenerate ADP and the inorganic phosphate. And this cycle keeps happening. So these 2 reactions, or these 2 specific parts, keep the 2 reactions coupled together. So let's review that. So what are the name of the 2 stages of photosynthesis? We have the light-dependent reaction and then the Calvin cycle. Where do they happen? The thylakoid for the light-dependent reaction, those discs, those green discs, and the Calvin cycle is in the stroma. Inputs. For the light-dependent reaction, it requires light, water, NADP plus, and ADP plus an inorganic phosphate. And for the Calvin cycle, it requires carbon dioxide, NADPH, and ATP. The outputs are oxygen as a waste product, NADPH and ATP. And then for the Calvin cycle, a sugar, NADP plus, ADP, and an inorganic phosphate. And these two stages are coupled together by the creation of NADPH and ATP, and then when they regenerate and become, or we could say become oxidized and become NADP plus, an ADP, and an inorganic phosphate again. Thank you for listening, and I hope this was helpful.